at the very edge of time, before calendars, before memory learned how to count itself. There is a silence so deep, it feels almost alive. This is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting, of landscapes untouched by human footsteps, of winds that carried no names, of stars reflected in waters that had never known a story. To stand here, conceptually, is to stand outside everything familiar. No nations exist yet. No religions have been spoken into form. No walls, no roads, monuments. Only the slow breathing of the earth itself, moving through cycles that seem eternal, and somewhere within that immense quiet, humanity is about to begin something it has never stopped doing since: remembering. 50,000 years ago is not simply a number, it is a depth. A vertical drop through layers of time so vast that the modern mind struggles to hold it. Civilizations we revere as ancient, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, have not even been imagined yet. Agriculture does not exist. Writing does not exist. Even the idea of history has not been invented, and yet humans are already here, already thinking, already adapting, already carrying stories within them that will stretch further than anything else our species has ever created. To approach this moment is to confront how fragile our sense of permanence truly is. Everything we consider foundational, technology, borders, recorded knowledge, floats atop a much deeper human ocean. Most cultures, when traced backward far enough, dissolve into uncertainty. Their origins blur, fragment, and vanish. But there is one cultural current that does not break. It does not disappear into the darkness of prehistory. Instead, it continues quietly, resiliently flowing from a time before memory had a written form, all the way into the present moment. This story begins not with a conquest or a discovery, but with arrival. Not the arrival of empires, but of people, small groups of humans standing at the edge of a world they have never seen before. Behind them lies a long journey through unfamiliar lands. Ahead of them, an entire continent waits in silence. They do not know its name. They do not know what lives within it. They only know that they must survive. The earth they step into is different from ours. Sea levels are lower. Coastlines stretch farther into the horizon. Giant animals roam the land, creatures so immense they feel almost mythological to us now. The climate shifts slowly, but relentlessly. Survival here will demand more than strength. It will require attention, memory, relationship. What makes this moment extraordinary is not simply that humans arrive here, but that they stay. They do not pass through and vanish. They do not collapse after a few generations. They adapt so completely, so precisely, that their way of life becomes inseparable from the land itself. Over time, survival transforms into knowledge, and knowledge transforms into culture, and that culture does something almost unheard of in human history. It endures. When we speak of the world's oldest culture, we are not talking about ruins buried beneath sand or stone. We are not speaking of artifacts locked behind glass. We are speaking of a continuous thread of human understanding, passed from generation to generation without interruption across 50 millennia. A living memory that has survived ice ages, rising seas, environmental collapse, and profound violence. A memory that has never relied on ink or paper, yet has outlasted most written traditions. This is difficult for the modern mind to grasp, because modern life is built on acceleration. We measure progress in decades, sometimes years. Technologies become obsolete within a generation. Cities rise and fall faster than ancient forests can grow. In this world, endurance feels almost unnatural. And yet here, at the edge of deep time, endurance is the central achievement. Imagine knowledge that does not belong to individuals, but to place. Knowledge that is not owned, but carried. Knowledge that cannot be separated from the land without losing its meaning. This is not history as a list of events, but history as a living relationship. A relationship between humans and earth that is renewed rather than consumed with each generation. To understand this culture, we must first let go of the idea that history moves only forward. Instead, It moves outward, through memory, through repetition, through careful listening. Time is not a line, but a landscape, and every step taken across it leaves a trace. In this world, the past is never fully gone. It exists in the way fire is used, not recklessly, but with intention. It exists in the paths walked across vast distances, paths remembered not by maps but by song. It exists in stories that do not merely entertain, but instruct, stories that encode law, morality, ecology, and identity into narratives that can survive thousands of years without being written down. Standing at this beginning, we are confronted with a profound question. What does it mean to be ancient? Is age measured by stone structures and dates carved into tablets? Or is it measured by continuity, the ability to remain oneself while the world transforms? The people who arrive here 50,000 years ago do not know they are beginning the longest unbroken cultural tradition in human history. They do not know their descendants will still speak of the same places, the same ancestral beings, the same laws of relationship tens of thousands of years later. They are not thinking about legacy. They are thinking about water, about shelter, about food, about children. And yet, it is precisely this focus on living, rather than conquering or recording, that allows their culture to persist. It grows not by expansion, but by deepening. Not by accumulation, but by care. Over time, the land becomes teacher, archive, and ancestor all at once. This documentary is not simply an exploration of the past. It is an invitation to slow down enough to feel time differently, to sense how brief our modern moment truly is, and how much wisdom exists beyond it. The story you are about to hear is not loud. It does not announce itself with monuments. It survives in quiet continuity, in memory carried gently forward. At the edge of deep time, humanity made a choice, perhaps without realizing it. A choice not to dominate the world, but to belong to it. That choice, echoed across 50,000 years, still speaks. And if we listen carefully enough, it may tell us not only where we came from, but what we have forgotten along the way. Long before the first line was ever scratched into stone, before symbols were asked to carry meaning on behalf of memory, humanity lived inside a world where time had no labels. There was no clear boundary between past and present. No sense that moments were something to be collected and stored. Life unfolded as an unbroken continuity, measured not in years, but in seasons, migrations, and the slow rhythm of change written into the land itself. This was a world before history had a name, before the idea of before and after mattered enough to be separated. Modern minds often imagine prehistory as a kind of darkness, an absence waiting to be filled. But this is a misunderstanding shaped by our dependence on writing. The lack of written records does not mean the absence of knowledge. It means knowledge took a different form, one that was lived rather than archived, spoken rather than inscribed. In this world, memory did not sit still on a page. It walked, sang, hunted, gathered, and aged alongside the people who carried it. To understand what it means to speak of the oldest culture on Earth, we must first unlearn the idea that history begins with writing. Writing is a tool, not a threshold of intelligence. For tens of thousands of years, human societies developed complex systems of law, ethics, environmental management, and spiritual meaning without a single written word. These systems were not crude placeholders waiting for civilization to arrive. They were complete in themselves, refined through constant interaction with reality. In the deep past, knowledge was inseparable from survival, knowing where water would appear after long dry seasons, recognizing the subtle signs of animal movement, understanding how fire could renew a landscape without destroying it. These were not abstract skills, they were the difference between life and extinction. Memory, therefore, became sacred. Forgetting was dangerous. Remembering was survival. This is why stories mattered so deeply. They were not entertainment, nor were they simple explanations for natural phenomena. Stories were vessels, carefully shaped containers designed to hold layers of meaning. Within them lived maps of the land, rules of behavior, warnings, and ancestral wisdom. A story could tell you where not to walk, when to harvest, how to treat others, and why the land deserved respect. all at once. And because stories were told repeatedly across generations, they remained alive, capable of adapting without losing their core truth. In this way, prehistory was not an empty prelude to real history. It was the longest and most formative chapter of the human story. It is only invisible to us because it does not conform to modern expectations of evidence. We look for buildings, inscriptions, empires. When we do not find them, we assume absence. But what if permanence does not always take the form of stone? Many cultures throughout human history have risen quickly and vanished just as fast. They leave behind ruins, fragmented records, and unanswered questions. Their disappearance feels dramatic because it is visible. But cultures built on endurance rather than expansion often leave quieter traces. Their continuity is not etched into monuments, but into ways of living that adapt rather than collapse. This is the kind of continuity that can survive for tens of thousands of years. Before history had a name, people did not think of themselves as standing at the beginning of anything. They were not inventing the future. They were maintaining balance. The goal was not to grow endlessly, but to remain in right relationship with the land, with animals, with one another. Time was not something to be conquered, it was something to be respected. In such a worldview, change was expected, but not feared. Landscapes shifted. Climates changed. Species appeared and disappeared. These transformations were woven into collective memory, not as catastrophes to be erased, but as lessons to be carried forward. Oral traditions, preserved events that modern science would only confirm tens of thousands of years later. Rising seas, changing coastlines, altered ecosystems. Memory became a bridge across immense spans of time. The modern obsession with beginnings often leads us to ask the wrong questions. We ask when something started, as if origin alone grants importance. But continuity is a far rarer achievement. Many cultures begin, very few endure. To endure requires flexibility without loss of identity, adaptation without erasure. It requires a relationship with the world that does not exhaust its foundations. In the absence of written timelines, time itself was experienced differently. The past was not distant. Ancestors were not abstract figures lost in a remote era. They were present, in stories, in place names, in the very shape of the land. To walk across certain landscapes was to walk through memory. Every hill, river, and path carried meaning layered over countless generations. Geography became a living archive. This is why attempts to compress ancient cultures into modern historical frameworks often fail. They are not linear narratives with clear beginnings and endings. They are circular, recursive, deeply rooted. Their strength lies not in accumulation, but in repetition. Each generation does not aim to surpass the previous one, but to uphold what has been entrusted to them. Before history had a name, there was no distinction between knowledge and responsibility. To know something was to be accountable for it. To carry a story meant to care for the land it described. Knowledge was relational. It existed between people, between humans and nature, between the present and the ancestral past. As we move closer to the present, we often imagine ourselves standing at the peak of human understanding. But the deeper we look into prehistory, the more that certainty begins to fracture. Intelligence did not suddenly appear with cities. Complexity did not begin with agriculture. Wisdom did not require writing. These assumptions say more about modern bias than about ancient reality. The culture at the heart of this story does not fit neatly into our categories because it was never meant to. It did not measure success by dominance or growth. It measured success by continuity, by the ability to remain human in a changing world. That ability was forged long before history learned how to name itself. To step into this time is to encounter humanity without the filters of modern ambition. People lived close enough to the world to feel its shifts intimately. They paid attention not because it was philosophical, but because it mattered. In doing so, they built something far more enduring than empires. A way of life capable of carrying memory across 50,000 years. This is the foundation upon which everything that follows will rest. not a moment of invention, but a long, patient cultivation of understanding. Before history had a name, humans were already writing themselves into the earth, using footsteps instead of ink, songs instead of stone, and memory instead of monuments. The journey begins long before land comes into view, long before feet touch unfamiliar soil, before new winds carry unfamiliar scents, before the horizon reveals anything solid at all. It begins with water, vast, shifting, and dangerous, for early humans moving through Southeast Asia toward what we now call Sahul. The ocean was not a boundary marked on a map. It was an unknown presence, alive with uncertainty, stretching farther than memory could guarantee safe passage. And yet, they crossed it. This alone tells us something essential. These were not people drifting aimlessly into fate. To cross open water requires intention. It requires planning, cooperation, and a belief, however fragile, that something lies beyond the visible edge of the world, whether by simple watercraft, rafts, or guided by currents and stars. These early crossings represent one of the most profound acts of human courage in prehistory, not because they sought conquest, but because they trusted possibility. The sea at that time was lower than today, revealing coastlines long since swallowed by rising waters. Islands sat closer together, but never close enough to remove risk. Storms could arrive without warning. Currents could pull travelers far off course. Once a group committed to crossing, there was no turning back. Behind them lay known lands. Ahead, only imagination and survival. What compels a group of humans to leave familiarity behind? It is tempting to imagine desperation, scarcity, conflict, environmental pressure, but movement is also curiosity. It is the human instinct to explore, to test boundaries, to see what exists beyond the immediate horizon. Migration is not always flight. Sometimes it is invitation. When the first humans arrived on the northern edges of the Australian continent, they stepped into a world that had never known their kind. The land had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Its ecosystems were finely balanced, its creatures unfamiliar and often immense. Giant marsupials roamed plains and forests. Birds larger than humans moved through ancient skies. Predators, unlike anything seen elsewhere, waited in silence. This was not a gentle world welcoming newcomers. It was a challenge. Arrival was not a single moment. It happened over generations, in waves small enough to leave no obvious trace at first. Groups moved along coasts, rivers, and open plains, following resources, learning patterns. Every step forward was also an act of learning: which plants healed, which poisoned, which animals could be hunted, which demanded avoidance, which landscapes offered shelter, which concealed danger. There were no maps, no inherited knowledge of this place. Everything had to be discovered, remembered, and passed on. Mistakes were costly. Survival demanded attentiveness at a level modern humans rarely experience. To live here was to observe constantly, to notice subtle changes in wind, animal behavior, and seasonal rhythms. Over time, these observations accumulated into understanding. Understanding became tradition. One of the most remarkable aspects of this arrival is not just that humans survived, but that they did so without overwhelming the land. Unlike later human expansions that stripped environments to exhaustion, these early communities adapted their behavior to the limits of the ecosystem. Fire was used carefully, not to destroy, but to manage growth. Hunting followed patterns that allowed animal populations to recover. Movement across the land prevented overuse of any single area. This was not environmentalism as ideology. It was necessity shaped into wisdom. A feedback loop between land and people emerged, one that rewarded restraint and punished excess. Over generations, this relationship hardened into cultural law. Survival strategies became moral principles. Caring for the land was not separate from caring for the community. They were the same act. As humans spread across the continent, they did not erase its isolation, they deepened it. Once here, populations remained largely cut off from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. This isolation would become one of the defining forces shaping the culture. Without constant external influence, Knowledge evolved inward, becoming highly specialized, intimately tuned to specific landscapes. In this isolation, something rare occurred. Culture was not repeatedly disrupted by invasion, assimilation, or replacement. Instead, it layered upon itself. New knowledge did not overwrite old knowledge, it integrated with it. Stories grew longer, richer, more complex. Memory extended backward without being severed. The act of arrival, then, was not just a geographic transition. It was the beginning of a long experiment in continuity, a test of whether humans could live in one place long enough to truly know it. Not dominate it, not extract from it, but understand it deeply. From this point on, identity would be inseparable from land. People did not simply live on the continent, they belonged to it. Place was not interchangeable. Each river, rock formation, and stretch of desert carried meaning shaped by experience and story. Movement across the land followed ancestral paths, routes remembered not by landmarks alone, but by narrative. The danger of romanticizing this arrival must be resisted. Life was not easy. Death was common. Children did not always survive. Seasons of abundance alternated with scarcity, but within these challenges, a resilient way of being emerged, one that valued balance over accumulation, memory over novelty. The first footsteps on this ancient shore did not echo loudly. They did not announce a turning point in the way modern history often imagines such moments, and yet, in hindsight, they mark one of the most significant events in the human story. Not because they led to empire, but because they led to endurance. Those early arrivals could not have known that their descendants would still speak of the same ancestral beings, still walk the same ceremonial paths, still recognize the same laws of relationship tens of thousands of years later. They were not building toward a future they could imagine. They were building toward survival, toward belonging. And perhaps that is why it lasted. In stepping onto an unfamiliar shore, these humans did something profoundly human. They trusted themselves to adapt. They trusted memory to carry what mattered. They trusted that life, lived attentively enough, could sustain itself far beyond any single lifetime. The ocean receded behind them. The land opened ahead, and a story began that has never truly ended. The land they entered was not neutral. It did not simply receive its new inhabitants and allow them to continue unchanged. From the moment humans began to move deeper into this vast continent, the environment began shaping them in return. Australia was unlike anywhere humanity had known before, older than most landscapes on Earth. Its soils were thin, ancient, and often unforgiving. Rivers did not always behave predictably. Rain arrived in extremes, either in sudden abundance or in long, punishing absence. To live here required more than adaptation. It required transformation. This was a continent of contrasts. Endless deserts opened beneath skies that seemed too wide, too exposed. Dense tropical regions pulsed with life, humidity, and unseen dangers. Mountain ranges weathered into soft silhouettes rather than sharp peaks, carrying the weight of deep geological time. Along the coasts, tides and mangroves shifted constantly, blurring the line between land and sea. No single strategy could ensure survival across all of it. Each region demanded its own understanding, its own rhythms, its own rules. As people spread across these environments, their ways of thinking evolved in response. The land did not allow for domination. Attempts to force it into submission were punished quickly. Instead, survival depended on reading subtle signs, changes in plant behavior, animal movement, wind direction, and temperature. Knowledge became observational, cumulative, and deeply contextual. Intelligence here was not about control, but about attunement. Over generations, this constant attentiveness reshaped cognition itself. Memory became expansive, capable of holding vast amounts of localized information. Stories grew not only as cultural expression, but as practical necessity. A narrative might encode the location of water holes, the timing of seasonal food sources, or warnings about dangerous terrain. To forget a story was not merely a cultural loss, it could be fatal. Isolation amplified this process. With little contact beyond the continent, there was no external reset, no sudden influx of foreign ideas to disrupt accumulated knowledge. Instead, understanding refined itself internally, adapting slowly as environments changed. This fostered a kind of intellectual patience rarely seen in fast-moving civilizations. Change was absorbed, not resisted. New realities were woven into existing frameworks rather than replacing them. The land also demanded humility. Droughts could last for years, floods could reshape entire regions overnight. Fire could devastate or renew, depending on how it was used. Humans learned that they were not separate from these forces. They were participants within them. Over time, this awareness solidified into cultural law. To act against the land was to act against oneself. One of the most profound ways this environment shaped human thought was through its scale. Distances were immense. Travel between regions could take weeks or months. There were no shortcuts. This fostered an understanding of time as something broad and patient. Urgency gave way to endurance. Decisions were made with future generations in mind, not immediate gain. In this context, ownership took on a different meaning. Land was not possessed in the modern sense. It was cared for, known, and inherited through responsibility rather than control. People belonged to places more than places belonged to people. Identity was tied to landscape so deeply that displacement was not just physical, it was existential. The environment also shaped social structures. In a land where resources could be scarce and unpredictable, cooperation was essential. Knowledge had to be shared, not hoarded. Conflict that fractured community could be catastrophic. As a result, systems of law and kinship developed to maintain balance, regulate behavior, and resolve disputes without widespread violence. These systems were not written, but they were precise, complex, and deeply respected. Even spirituality emerged directly from environmental experience. The land was not seen as inert matter, but as alive with agency and memory. Mountains, rivers, and plains were not just locations. They were ancestral presences. This was not abstract belief. It was a lived recognition that the land shaped human fate as much as humans shaped the land. Over thousands of years, as climates shifted and megafauna disappeared, the culture adapted without losing its core. Knowledge evolved, but its foundation, relationship with place, remained intact. This continuity is what allowed the culture to survive changes that destroyed others. It was flexible without becoming unrecognizable, rooted without becoming rigid. Modern science has only recently begun to appreciate the sophistication of this adaptation. Practices such as controlled burning, once misunderstood or dismissed, are now recognized as advanced land management techniques. These methods shaped ecosystems in ways that increased biodiversity and reduced catastrophic wildfires. They were not accidents, they were the result of generations of observation and refinement. The continent, in shaping the human mind, also shaped human values. Patience, respect, restraint, and attentiveness were not abstract virtues. They were survival traits. To live well here meant to listen more than act, to observe before deciding, to accept limits rather than constantly test them. In many ways, this land created a different kind of humanity. One that did not measure success by accumulation or expansion, but by balance and continuity. A humanity that understood that to endure, one must belong to place, to community, to memory. This transformation did not happen quickly. It unfolded across millennia, so gradually that no generation would have noticed it as change. And yet, when viewed across deep time, its effects are unmistakable. The continent did not just host one of the world's oldest cultures, it helped create it. To understand this culture without understanding the land is impossible. They are not separate stories. They are the same story, told through different forms. The land shaped the mind shaped the culture, and together they created a way of being human capable of surviving 50,000 years of change without losing itself. In a world increasingly disconnected from place, this ancient relationship offers a quiet challenge. It asks whether intelligence is always about advancement, or whether sometimes it is about staying, about learning a place so completely that leaving it behind no longer makes sense. Survival in this ancient world was never a matter of brute force alone. Strength mattered, but it was knowledge that kept people alive. Knowledge of stone, of fire, of movement, of timing. Each tool held in the hand was the result of countless failures remembered and refined. Each spark coaxed from dry wood carried with it generations of understanding about wind, moisture, and patience. Life here demanded intimacy with the materials of the world, and from that intimacy emerged a language spoken not in words, but in actions. Stone was not just a resource, it was a partner. Different types of stone behaved differently when struck, flaked, or shaped. Some shattered unpredictably, others split cleanly, producing edges sharp enough to cut hide, wood, or flesh with precision. Knowing which stone to choose, where to find it, and how to shape it required long experience. This knowledge was passed down not through instruction manuals, but through demonstration, repetition, and correction. A young hand learned by watching older hands, feeling the resistance of stone, learning when to strike and when to stop. Tools were rarely owned in isolation. They were part of a broader system of movement and sharing. A stone blade might travel with a group for years, repaired and reshaped as needed. When it finally broke beyond use, its fragments were not discarded without thought. Even broken stone held value, capable of being transformed into something else. Waste was not a concept easily afforded in a land that demanded restraint. Fire, perhaps more than any other element, defined the relationship between humans and their environment. Fire offered warmth, protection, and the ability to cook food, unlocking nutrients that would otherwise remain inaccessible. But fire was also dangerous. Left unchecked, it could destroy food sources, shelter, and entire landscapes. Learning to use fire without being consumed by it was one of the most critical achievements of early human life on this continent. Over time, fire became more than a tool. It became a method of communication with the land, controlled burning-shaped ecosystems, encouraging new growth and attracting animals. It reduced fuel loads, preventing catastrophic wildfires long before such terms existed. Fire was applied with intention, guided by season, weather, and long-held knowledge. This was not accidental stewardship. It was deliberate, practiced, and refined. Movement across the land was equally informed by deep understanding. People did not wander aimlessly. Their paths followed patterns shaped by water availability, seasonal food sources, and ceremonial obligations. Routes were remembered through story, song, and repetition. Navigation relied not on landmarks alone, but on memory layered with meaning. To walk these paths was to activate knowledge, to recall lessons embedded in the land itself. Hunting, too, was governed by more than hunger. It required patience, observation, and respect. Animals were not simply targets. They were part of a shared system. Overhunting could unbalance ecosystems and threaten future survival. As a result, hunting practices were regulated by cultural rules that limited excess and emphasized sustainability. Certain animals were taken only at specific times. Others were avoided entirely in certain contexts. These rules were not arbitrary. They were born of long observation and hard-earned consequence. Food gathering was equally complex. Plants that nourished could also harm if prepared incorrectly. Some required careful processing to remove toxins. This knowledge was precise and unforgiving. A mistake could lead to illness or death. Yet, across generations, these techniques were preserved, refined, and shared. What modern science would later label as chemistry and botany existed here as lived experience. What ties all of this together is memory. Survival depended on remembering what worked and what did not. But memory alone was not enough. It had to be organized, transmitted, and protected from distortion. This is where culture stepped in. Stories, rituals, and social norms acted as stabilizing forces, ensuring that essential knowledge survived beyond individual lifetimes. Children learned not through abstract instruction, but through participation. They watched, mimicked, and slowly absorbed the rhythms of daily life. Knowledge was not rushed. Mastery took time, mistakes were expected, but guidance was constant. In this way, learning was embedded in living rather than separated from it. The absence of writing did not mean an absence of complexity. On the contrary, it meant that knowledge had to be robust enough to survive oral transmission. Information was encoded in multiple forms: stories, songs, practices, so that even if one layer faltered, others remained. Redundancy became resilience. Fire, stone, and movement formed a triad of survival that shaped both body and mind. Hands grew skilled, eyes grew observant, minds grew patient. Intelligence here was not about abstraction, but about integration, connecting observation, memory, and action into a seamless whole. Modern perspectives often underestimate this kind of intelligence because it leaves few monuments. Stone tools are small. Fire leaves fleeting traces. Paths disappear over time. But their impact was immense. These practices allowed people to inhabit one of the most challenging environments on Earth without exhausting it, and to do so continuously for tens of thousands of years. In this world, survival was not a solitary endeavor. It was communal. Knowledge was shared because survival depended on it. Hoarding information would have been self-defeating. The success of one was tied to the success of all. This interdependence shaped values that prioritize cooperation over competition. Over time, these survival strategies hardened into identity. To know how to make fire, shape stone, and move through the land was to know who you were. These were not skills separate from culture. They were culture. They defined belonging, responsibility, and continuity. The language of survival spoken here was quiet, precise, and deeply effective. It did not announce itself with grand structures or written records. It revealed itself through endurance. Through the simple fact that generation after generation lived, adapted, and remembered. And in that remembering, they built one of the most enduring human stories the world has ever known. At a certain point, survival alone was no longer enough to explain how people lived within this land. Knowledge of fire, stone, and movement kept bodies alive, but something deeper began to take shape alongside it. Something that bound memory, place, and meaning into a single, living framework. The land was no longer just navigated. It was spoken to, listened to, and remembered. This was the moment when landscape transformed into story. Every place carried more than physical characteristics. A hill was not only a rise in the ground, a river was not merely flowing water. Each feature became layered with meaning through experience and repetition. Over generations, events, hunts, journeys, deaths, births, and transformations became anchored to specific locations. To stand in a place was to stand inside a story that had been told many times before. These stories were not decorative additions to life. They were the structure that held knowledge together. A narrative could explain why a place mattered, what behavior was expected there, and what consequences followed disrespect. Through story, the land itself became a teacher. Memory was no longer stored only in the mind, but distributed across the environment. This transformation changed how time was experienced. The past did not recede into distance. It remained present, activated each time a story was told or a place was visited. Ancestors were not abstract figures lost in history. They were participants in the present, their actions echoing through the landscape. To walk across the land was to move through layers of time at once. Storytelling became a method of navigation, not just through space, but through life. It guided moral behavior, social responsibility, and environmental care. Stories explained why certain animals were treated with respect, why specific places required restraint, and why actions taken today would ripple far beyond the present moment. In this way, story functioned as law without written codes, governance without rulers. The power of these narratives lay in their flexibility. They were not static texts, fixed in time. They evolved subtly as conditions changed, allowing new experiences to be woven into ancient frameworks. This adaptability ensured continuity without stagnation. The core meanings remained intact, even as details shifted to reflect new realities. Songs emerged as especially potent vessels of memory. Rhythm and melody made information easier to remember and harder to distort. A song could encode a journey across hundreds of kilometers, describing landmarks, water sources, and dangers along the way. To sing was to recall was to survive. Music became infrastructure. As stories accumulated, they formed a vast mental map of the continent. This map did not exist in one place or one person. It was distributed across communities, each responsible for maintaining and transmitting specific parts of the whole. Knowledge was localized yet interconnected, ensuring that no single loss could erase everything. This shared custodianship reinforced social bonds. To carry a story was to carry responsibility. Forgetting was not merely a personal failure. It endangered the community. As a result, memory was treated with reverence. Elders were respected, not because of authority imposed, but because of knowledge embodied. The act of telling stories was itself ritualized. It required attentiveness, appropriate timing, and respect for context. Not every story was told everywhere or to everyone. Knowledge was revealed gradually, aligned with readiness and responsibility. This careful stewardship protected both the integrity of the stories and the people who carried them. Through this system, the land itself became inseparable from identity. People did not define themselves solely by family or group, but by their relationship to place. Certain stories belonged to certain landscapes, and certain landscapes belonged to those entrusted with their care. Identity was geographical, spiritual, and communal all at once. This way of knowing stands in stark contrast to modern systems that extract information from context and store it abstractly. Here, knowledge could not be separated from lived experience. To truly understand a story, one had to walk the land it described, feel its climate, and observe its rhythms. Understanding was embodied. Over time, this deep integration created resilience. As environments shifted due to climate change, stories adapted, incorporating new lessons while preserving foundational principles. Memory stretched across generations, maintaining continuity through change rather than resisting it. The transformation of land into story also shaped emotional life. Places became sources of comfort, identity, and belonging. Loss of place was not just displacement. It was a rupture in memory and meaning. This deep attachment fostered care, but also vulnerability. The land was loved not as property, but as kin. In this world, to harm the land was to harm the story, and to harm the story was to harm oneself. Ethics were not imposed from above. They emerged organically from lived relationship. Right and wrong were understood through consequence, memory, and respect. This was the foundation upon which later spiritual and cosmological systems would emerge. Before formal beliefs, before structured cosmology, there was story, quiet, persistent, and powerful. It allowed humans to situate themselves within a vast world without needing to dominate it. The land became a living archive, far older and more durable than stone or parchment. While written records can burn or decay, this archive endured through practice and memory. It survived because it was lived daily, reinforced by necessity and belonging. When the land became a story, culture achieved something extraordinary. It anchored itself so deeply in place that it could survive immense spans of time without losing coherence. This was not accidental. It was the result of careful attention, respect, and an understanding that memory is strongest when it is shared with the world itself. In this way, story did not merely describe reality. It created it. It shaped how people moved, thought, and cared. It transformed survival into meaning and meaning into continuity. And through that transformation, a culture took root that would endure longer than any empire, carried forward not by stone monuments, but by footsteps, voices, and memory. As stories deepened and spread across the land, They began to organize themselves into something larger than memory alone. What emerged was not a religion in the modern sense, nor a collection of myths meant to explain the unexplainable. It was a framework through which reality itself was understood and maintained. This framework did not exist apart from daily life, but flowed through it, shaping behavior, identity, and responsibility. This is what is often translated as the dreaming, though no single word can fully contain its meaning. The dreaming was not confined to a distant past. It was not a creation story sealed off from the present. It existed simultaneously in what had been, what was, and what would continue to be. Time within this system did not move forward in a straight line. It circulated. Ancestral beings were not gone. They remained active, their presence embedded in the land, the stories, and the laws governing life. To live was to participate in an ongoing act of creation and maintenance. These ancestral beings were not gods watching from above. They were forces that moved through the landscape, shaping rivers, mountains, animals, and people. Their actions established patterns that humans were expected to follow, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The world functioned as it did because these patterns were respected. When they were ignored, imbalance followed. What makes this system extraordinary is its precision. The dreaming functioned as law, but not law imposed through punishment alone. It was law woven into reality. Each story carried instructions for behavior, relationships, and land care. These instructions were not optional. They were validated continuously by lived experience. When people acted in alignment with them, the world remained stable. When they did not, consequences were immediate and undeniable. In this way, belief was inseparable from practice. There was no division between sacred and secular life. Hunting, gathering, ceremony, and social interaction all existed within the same moral universe. Every action echoed beyond the individual, rippling outward into community and land. Responsibility was collective, and accountability was shared. The dreaming also served as an archive far more complex than any written record. Within its stories lived detailed knowledge of geography, ecology, kinship, and history. These stories did not merely describe the world. They encoded instructions for how to move through it safely and respectfully. They explained which relationships were permitted, which were forbidden, and why. They preserved memory not as static information, but as lived obligation. Initiation into this system was gradual. Knowledge was not given all at once. It was revealed in layers, aligned with maturity and responsibility. This ensured that power and understanding grew together. Knowing more meant being accountable for more. This balance prevented misuse of knowledge and reinforced trust within the community. Ceremony played a central role in maintaining this architecture of belief. Through song, dance, body painting, and ritual movement, stories were reactivated. Ceremony was not performance, it was renewal. By reenacting ancestral journeys and events, people reaffirmed their place within the ongoing story of the land. These acts kept the world in balance, not symbolically, but practically, reinforcing shared values and knowledge. The land itself was inseparable from this system. Specific places were tied to specific stories and responsibilities. Access to certain knowledge depended on relationship to place. This prevented homogenization of culture and ensured that diversity flourished across regions. Each area developed its own expressions while remaining connected to the broader framework. This decentralized structure is one of the reasons the culture endured. There was no single point of failure. Knowledge was distributed, guarded, and renewed constantly. Even if parts were disrupted, others remained intact. Continuity was built into the system. The dreaming also shaped emotional life. It provided a sense of belonging that extended beyond individual lifespan. People knew where they came from and where they fit within a vast web of relationships stretching back to the beginning of time. Death was not an end, but a transformation within an ongoing cycle. Grief existed, but it was held within a larger understanding of continuity. Modern observers often struggle to comprehend this worldview because it resists categorization. It is not merely spiritual, not merely social, not merely ecological. It is all of these at once. Attempts to isolate it into a single category flatten its meaning. The dreaming was not an idea people believed in. It was the way reality was experienced. This worldview also fostered restraint. Because the land was alive with ancestral presence, exploitation was unthinkable. To take more than needed was to disrupt balance. To damage a place was to damage a story that could not be replaced. Ethics emerged not from abstract principles, but from intimacy with consequence. The strength of this system lies in its longevity. While belief systems built on fixed texts often fracture under change, this one adapted without losing coherence. New experiences were absorbed, interpreted through existing stories, and woven into the fabric of understanding. Change did not threaten the system. It nourished it. Over tens of thousands of years, this architecture of belief guided countless generations through environmental shifts, scarcity, and abundance. It survived precisely because it did not demand control over the world, only relationship with it. It asked humans to listen before acting, to remember before deciding. In a modern world, often fractured by disconnection from land, from history, from one another, this ancient framework offers a different vision of intelligence, one that values continuity over conquest, balance over dominance, and responsibility over ownership. The dreaming was not a relic of the past. It was a living system, constantly renewed through practice, memory, and care. It allowed a culture to remain itself across 50,000 years of change, and in doing so, it quietly challenges the assumption that progress requires abandonment of the old. Sometimes, survival requires remembering exactly who you are across the vastness of the continent, where distances stretch beyond the horizon and landmarks can vanish into sameness. Memory learned how to move. It did not take the form of lines etched onto surfaces or symbols fixed in place. Instead, it traveled through voice, rhythm, and repetition. What emerged was one of the most extraordinary navigational systems ever created by humans, a network of invisible pathways known today as songlines. To understand songlines is to understand that movement itself can be an act of remembrance. These were not simply songs sung for pleasure or ritual alone. They were living maps, carrying precise information across hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers. A song could describe a journey step by step, embedding landmarks, water sources, terrain changes, and dangers within melody and verse. To sing was to travel, even while standing still. Each songline traced the path of ancestral beings as they moved across the land during the formative period of creation. As these beings shaped the world, their journeys became templates for human movement. By following these paths, people were not only navigating space, they were reenacting the original acts that gave the land its form and meaning. Travel was therefore both practical and sacred, grounded in survival and cosmology at once. What made this system resilient was its integration into daily life. Songlines were learned gradually, often beginning in childhood. Simple verses introduced local paths, while more complex sequences were revealed with maturity and responsibility. Knowledge was layered, ensuring that critical information was retained while sensitive knowledge remained protected. Unlike written maps, which remained static even as landscapes changed, songlines evolved. As environments shifted due to climate or seasonal variation, verses could be adjusted without breaking the underlying structure. This allowed the system to remain accurate across immense spans of time. Adaptation was built into memory itself. The precision of this oral cartography challenges modern assumptions about the limits of non-written knowledge. Songlines were not vague poetic expressions. They contained detailed, actionable information. A verse might signal where water could be found after long droughts, how to recognize a safe crossing, or which areas were to be avoided during certain seasons. To misunderstand a song was to risk death. Because of this, accuracy mattered deeply. Songs were repeated constantly, reinforced through ceremony and daily use. Errors were corrected not through punishment, but through repetition and communal responsibility. Memory was not an individual burden. It was shared and safeguarded by the group. Songlines also functioned as bridges between communities. Different groups held custodianship over different sections of these paths. When travelers moved beyond their own territories, they relied on the hospitality and knowledge of others to continue safely. This fostered networks of exchange, trust, and interdependence across vast regions. Movement encouraged connection rather than isolation. In this way, songlines helped maintain social cohesion across the continent. They created a shared framework that respected local autonomy while enabling cooperation. No single group controlled the entire system. Knowledge was distributed, preventing centralization and reducing vulnerability. The act of singing while traveling served practical purposes beyond navigation. Rhythm helped maintain pace during long journeys. Melody made information easier to recall under stress or fatigue. Partition anchored attention, reducing the risk of distraction in environments where a moment of inattention could be fatal. But songlines were more than tools. They were expressions of identity. To know a songline was to know where you belonged. It defined relationships to land, ancestors, and neighboring groups. Losing access to a songline meant losing a part of oneself. Memory and identity were inseparable. The spiritual dimension of songlines did not diminish their practicality. Instead, it reinforced it. Because these paths were tied to ancestral journeys, they carried moral weight. Masseuse of a songline, traveling without permission, neglecting obligations, or disrespecting associated places, was not merely a social offense. It was a disruption of cosmic order. Ceremonies reinforced these responsibilities. Through communal singing and movement, people reaffirmed their connection to the land and to one another. These gatherings renewed memory, corrected errors, and strengthened bonds. They ensured that songlines remained alive rather than fossilized. The resilience of this system is evident in its longevity. Long after coastlines shifted and environments transformed, songlines preserved memories of ancient landscapes. Some songs describe features that no longer exist above water, echoing submerged coastlines lost to rising seas. These are not legends, they are memories carried across millennia. For modern observers, this challenges conventional distinctions between myth and history. Songlines do not fit neatly into either category. They are not fictional narratives, nor are they detached records of events. They are lived memory, activated through practice, sustained through care. In a world increasingly reliant on external storage for knowledge, songlines demonstrate a different kind of intelligence. One that resides within the body and the community, one that requires presence, attention, and responsibility. Knowledge here cannot be consumed passively. It must be carried. The disappearance of songlines through disruption, displacement, or neglect represents more than cultural loss. It is the loss of an entire way of knowing, a way that has proven capable of guiding humans safely across vast and challenging landscapes for tens of thousands of years. To walk a songline is to participate in an unbroken conversation between past and present. It is to acknowledge that memory can be alive, mobile, and precise without ever being written down. In following these invisible roads, people did not just move across the land, they kept time itself in motion. Through songlines, memory learned how to travel, and in doing so, it ensured that culture could move, adapt, and endure across one of the longest spans of human history the world has ever known. When people imagine ancient societies, they often picture towering structures, rigid hierarchies, and rulers whose power is etched into stone. They imagine cities rising from the land, kings issuing commands, and laws enforced from above. But across this continent, an entirely different kind of social order emerged, one that did not rely on centralized authority, monumental architecture, or permanent settlements. It was a culture without kings or cities, and yet it functioned with remarkable stability for tens of thousands of years. At first glance, such a system can appear fragile, even primitive, to modern eyes. Without formal government, how were disputes resolved? Without written law, how was behavior regulated? Without cities, how was culture preserved? These questions arise from assumptions shaped by later civilizations. They overlook the possibility that complexity does not require concentration, and order does not require domination. Social organization here was decentralized but not chaotic. Communities were structured through intricate kinship systems that defined relationships, responsibilities, and obligations. These systems governed who could marry whom, how resources were shared, and how conflicts were addressed. Kinship was not merely about family ties, it was a framework for social cohesion, ensuring balance and mutual accountability. Leadership existed, but it was situational rather than absolute. Authority flowed from knowledge, experience, and trust rather than inherited power. Elders held influence because they carried memory of land, of stories, of law. Their guidance was respected not through force, but through recognition of responsibility. Leadership could shift depending on context, ensuring flexibility and preventing concentration of power. Law was woven into everyday life. It did not stand apart as an abstract code enforced by punishment alone. Instead, it was embedded in stories, ceremonies, and social expectations. Right and wrong were understood through consequence and relationship rather than decree. When disputes arose, they were addressed through negotiation, ritual, and restitution rather than domination. This approach to governance prioritized harmony over control. Maintaining balance within the group and with the land was more important than asserting authority. Conflict was not ignored, but it was managed in ways that minimized long-term disruption. Social cohesion was treated as a vital resource, one that required constant care. The absence of cities did not mean the absence of culture. Culture lived in movement, in gatherings, in shared practices. Seasonal ceremonies brought groups together, reinforcing identity and renewing bonds. Knowledge circulated through these gatherings, ensuring continuity even as people moved across vast territories. Mobility was a strength rather than a weakness. Without permanent cities, communities could respond flexibly to environmental changes. They could move away from scarcity and return when conditions improved. This reduced pressure on resources and prevented the ecological exhaustion that often accompanies sedentary expansion. The lack of monumental architecture also reflected a different relationship with time. There was no need to leave permanent marks to assert presence or legacy. Continuity was ensured through memory and practice rather than stone. Identity did not depend on structures that outlasted individuals, but on relationships that were renewed each generation. Trade and exchange existed, but not as engines of accumulation. Objects moved between groups, strengthening alliances and sharing resources. These exchanges were often symbolic as well as practical, reinforcing trust and mutual obligation. Wealth was not measured by possession, but by relationship. This system required a high degree of social intelligence. Individuals had to be attentive to context, aware of relationships, and responsive to communal needs. Social mistakes carried consequences, not because of enforced punishment, but because they threatened trust. Reputation mattered deeply. Cooperation was not optional. It was essential. The absence of kings meant the absence of conquest as a cultural goal. There were conflicts, but there was no drive toward territorial domination. Land was not something to be seized and held through force. It was something to be cared for through relationship. Boundaries existed, but they were negotiated and respected rather than imposed. This social structure also allowed for remarkable cultural diversity. Without a central authority enforcing uniformity, different regions developed distinct languages, practices, and expressions. Diversity did not threaten cohesion because it existed within a shared framework of law and story. Unity was achieved through shared principles rather than identical practices. From a modern perspective, it can be difficult to recognize the sophistication of such a system because it leaves few physical traces. There are no palaces to excavate, no written laws to translate. But the true measure of a social system is not how much it builds, but how long it lasts. By that measure, this decentralized order stands among the most successful in human history. Over tens of thousands of years, it absorbed change without collapsing. It adapted to environmental shifts, population changes, and internal challenges without resorting to authoritarian control. It survived precisely because it did not depend on fragile concentrations of power. This way of living challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about progress. It suggests that stability does not require hierarchy, and that complexity can flourish without cities. It asks whether domination is truly necessary for order, or whether order can emerge from mutual responsibility. In a world where centralized systems often fail spectacularly, this ancient social structure offers a quiet counterexample. It demonstrates that human societies can organize themselves around relationship rather than control, memory rather than monument, and balance rather than growth. Culture without kings or cities is not the culture without order. It is a culture that locates order in people rather than institutions, and in doing so, created a form of social resilience capable of enduring longer than any empire humanity has ever known. Long before stone was stacked into monuments or words were pressed into clay, humans were already leaving marks that spoke across time. These marks were not meant to dominate the landscape or announce power. They were quieter, more intimate, and in many ways more enduring. Art, in this ancient world, was not a separate activity reserved for specialists. It was a way of thinking, remembering, and relating, and some of the oldest surviving examples of this impulse are found here, etched and painted onto rock surfaces that have watched over tens of thousands of years of human presence. These images do not confront the viewer with grand declarations. Instead, they invite attention. A hand pressed against stone, its outline traced in pigment, a kangaroo rendered with careful lines, its form both familiar and symbolic. Abstract shapes layered over older ones, building a visual conversation across generations. Each mark is deliberate. Each carries intention. Together, they form one of the longest continuous artistic traditions on Earth. What makes this art extraordinary is not only its age, but its continuity. In many parts of the world, artistic styles appear and disappear alongside the cultures that create them. Here, styles evolve slowly, often layering new expressions over old ones rather than replacing them. The rock face became a canvas shared across millennia. Time did not erase earlier images, it conversed with them. Art was never purely decorative, it carried knowledge. Some images encoded information about animals, seasons, and behavior. Others marked important places, ceremonial sites, meeting grounds, or areas of spiritual significance. To understand the art fully required context, stories, songs, and practices that brought images to life. Without that context, the images risk appearing static or mysterious. Within it, they were dynamic, instructive, and alive. The act of creating art was often ceremonial. It involved preparation, permission, and responsibility. Certain images could only be made by those with the right knowledge and standing. This ensured continuity and protected meaning from distortion. Art was not a free-for-all expression of individuality. It was a collective act, grounded in tradition and accountability. Body painting extended this artistic impulse beyond stone. Human bodies became moving canvases, carrying patterns that signaled identity, status, and ceremonial role. These designs were temporary, but their meanings were not. They connected individuals to ancestors, stories, and land. Through paint and movement, the body itself became part of the cultural archive. One of the most striking aspects of this artistic tradition is its relationship with time. These images were not created to be admired by distant future audiences. They were made for the present, for the community, the ancestors, and the land itself. Their survival is a byproduct of care and continuity, not a goal in itself. And yet, they endure, offering modern observers a rare window into minds separated from us by unimaginable spans of time. Modern science has only recently begun to grasp the true age of some of these artworks. Advances in dating techniques have pushed timelines further back than previously believed, revealing that some images were created tens of thousands of years ago. This forces a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions about when symbolic thought and artistic expression emerged. Here, they were not late developments. They were foundational. Art also played a role in maintaining social cohesion. Shared symbols reinforced shared understanding. They provided a visual language that complemented oral tradition, anchoring stories to place. In this way, art functioned as memory made visible. It helped stabilize knowledge across generations, reducing the risk of loss or misinterpretation. The locations of these artworks were rarely random. Rock shelters, cliff faces, and caves offered protection from the elements, but they also carried meaning. These were places where the boundary between worlds felt thinner, between past and present, between human and ancestral. Creating art in such spaces reinforced their significance and ensured their care. Unlike later artistic traditions that celebrate novelty and individual innovation, this art valued continuity. New works respected old ones. Change occurred, but it was incremental, respectful, and integrated. This approach mirrors the broader cultural emphasis on endurance rather than disruption. For modern viewers accustomed to galleries and museums, it can be difficult to appreciate art that exists outside those contexts. Removed from its landscape, stripped of its stories, ancient art risks becoming aestheticized rather than understood. Its power lies not only in form, but in relationship to land, to memory, to lived practice. These images also challenge the notion that early humans were primarily concerned with survival at the expense of expression. Even in environments that demanded constant attention and care, people found time and meaning in creation. This suggests that art is not a luxury of abundance, but a fundamental human need, a way of making sense of the world and one's place within it. Over thousands of years, as climates shifted and societies adapted, art remained a constant thread. It evolved alongside other aspects of culture, absorbing new influences without losing coherence. This resilience mirrors the resilience of the culture itself. Both endured by balancing flexibility with continuity. Today, these ancient artworks face new threats: erosion, vandalism, and the pressures of a changing world. Their survival now depends not only on the descendants of those who created them, but on broader recognition of their value. They are not relics of a vanished past. They are evidence of a living tradition that has weathered immense change. To stand before one of these images is to feel time compress. The hand that pressed pigment against stone so long ago was human, just like ours. The intention behind it to remember, to belong, to communicate, remains instantly recognizable. Across tens of thousands of years, art bridges the distance, reminding us that the human impulse to create meaning is older than civilization itself. In these marks on stone, we see not just the beginnings of art, but the persistence of humanity. Quiet, patient declaration that memory matters, that place matters, and that even without cities or kings, people found ways to speak to the future. The world did not remain still as generations passed. Ice advanced and retreated across distant continents. Sea levels rose slowly, swallowing coastlines that had once been walked with confidence. Rain patterns shifted, deserts expanded, forests contracted, and rivers altered their paths. For many cultures, such changes proved catastrophic. Ways of life collapsed when environments no longer matched inherited knowledge. But here, something different happened. Memory proved stronger than disruption. Across tens of thousands of years, people witnessed transformations so vast that modern humans struggled to comprehend them. Lands that were once open plains became seabeds. Islands disappeared beneath water. Animals that had shaped daily life vanished entirely. Yet these changes did not erase culture. They were absorbed into it. The key to this endurance was not resistance to change, but attentiveness to it. Environmental shifts were not treated as anomalies to be denied. They were observed, remembered, and integrated into stories that could be carried forward. Knowledge did not freeze in time. It evolved alongside the world it described. Oral traditions preserved memories of events long before written records existed anywhere on Earth. Stories spoke of rising waters, of coastlines retreating, of land bridges disappearing. For generations, these accounts were treated not as myths, but as inherited knowledge, warnings and explanations woven into cultural memory. Only recently has modern science confirmed the accuracy of many of these narratives, aligning them with geological evidence of ancient floods and climate change. This capacity to remember deep environmental time required a different relationship with history. Memory was not limited to human lifespans. It extended backward through story, song, and ceremony, anchoring present understanding in ancestral experience. The past was not distant, it was active, constantly informing decisions in the present. When climates cooled or warmed, food sources shifted, hunting strategies adapted, movement patterns changed, but the underlying framework, respect for balance, attentiveness to land, and shared responsibility remained intact. This allowed flexibility without loss of identity. Change did not mean abandonment. It meant adjustment. One of the most remarkable aspects of this long memory is its precision. Stories did not simply say that the world had once been different. They described how and why it changed. They identified specific places affected by floods, specific routes that were no longer safe, specific resources that had disappeared. This level of detail could only be preserved through constant repetition and communal validation. Such memory was not passive, it required active participation. Each generation took responsibility for carrying what had been entrusted to them. Elders ensured accuracy through careful teaching. Ceremonies reinforced key narratives. Mistakes were corrected through repetition rather than punishment. Memory was treated as a living obligation. The disappearance of megafauna posed one of the greatest challenges. Large animals that had once played central roles in ecosystems and human subsistence vanished over time. Rather than collapsing, culture adapted, hunting focused on different species. Practices evolved. Stories preserved memory of these creatures, ensuring that their loss was not forgotten, even as life moved forward. This ability to adapt without erasing the past stands in contrast to many later societies that responded to environmental stress through overexploitation or conflict. Here, restraint and observation guided response. Limits were recognized and respected. Survival depended not on domination, but on alignment with changing conditions. Fire management evolved alongside these shifts. Burning practices were adjusted to suit new vegetation patterns and climates. What remained constant was the principle of care. Fire was used to renew, not destroy. Knowledge accumulated through long observation allowed people to anticipate consequences rather than react to disaster. The long memory of change also shaped worldview. People understood that the world was not fixed, and neither were they. Permanence was not expected. Continuity lay not in unchanging conditions, but in the ability to respond wisely. This fostered humility and patience. Generation assumed it had reached a final or superior state. In a culture shaped by such deep time, urgency took on a different meaning. Decisions were not made solely for immediate benefit. They were evaluated in terms of long-term impact. The future was not abstract, it was populated by descendants whose well-being depended on present restraint. Modern societies often treat climate change as unprecedented, something beyond historical experience. But this ancient culture lived through dramatic environmental shifts without collapsing. This does not mean the changes were easy or painless. They brought loss and hardship, but they were not met with denial. They were met with adaptation grounded in memory. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about progress and intelligence. It suggests that the ability to endure change may be a more meaningful measure of success than rapid growth or technological dominance. It invites reflection on what kinds of knowledge are truly resilient. The preservation of environmental memory across such immense spans of time is not accidental. It is the result of cultural systems designed to carry knowledge safely through uncertainty. Stories, songs, and ceremonies acted as vessels strong enough to survive when conditions changed. When rising seas erased familiar coastlines, memory ensured that loss was not forgotten. When animals disappeared, stories preserved their place in the world. When landscapes transformed, knowledge adapted rather than vanished. In this way, culture became a bridge across deep time, linking past, present, and future. The long memory of change also fostered empathy with the land itself. People understood that landscapes, like humans, had histories. They bore scars and transformations. Respect for place included respect for its past. This discouraged reckless behavior and encouraged care in an age where written records span only a fraction of human existence. This oral preservation of deep time stands as one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, proves that memory does not require ink to endure. It requires commitment, responsibility, and relationship. Through ice ages, floods, and ecological upheaval, this culture did not merely survive. It remembered, and in remembering, it learned how to move forward without severing itself from what came before. This is the quiet strength that carried it across 50,000 years, a strength rooted not in resistance to change, but in understanding it. At the heart of this story lies a claim so vast that it almost resists belief. An unbroken line of cultural continuity stretching back more than 50,000 years. Not a revival, not a reconstruction, but a living thread, carried hand to hand, voice to voice, place to place, across a span of time that dwarfs most of what humanity remembers. To speak of such continuity is to challenge how history itself is usually understood. In most parts of the world, cultures are layered like sediment, one replaces another, often violently. Languages vanish, beliefs fragment. Practices survive only as echoes in ruins or texts that require translation. Even the most celebrated civilizations endured for a few thousand years at most before collapsing, transforming, or being absorbed. Continuity, in the deepest sense, is rare. Here, however, continuity did not depend on empire, writing, or centralized power. It depended on something more fragile and more resilient at the same time. Relationship to land, to story, to law, and to responsibility. These relationships were renewed continuously, generation after generation, without interruption long enough to break the chain. This does not mean nothing changed. On the contrary, almost everything changed. Environments shifted. Species disappeared. Social arrangements evolved, but the underlying framework that gave meaning to these changes endured. Identity was not defined by static forms, but by ongoing participation in a shared system of understanding. Modern science has begun to recognize this continuity through multiple lines of evidence. Archaeology reveals persistent occupation of the same regions across tens of thousands of years. Genetic studies show deep ancestry rooted in place, rather than waves of replacement. Linguistics reveals families of languages that diverged gradually rather than abruptly. Anthropology uncovers practices that align across immense spans of time, even as their expressions shift. Taken together, these findings tell a story that cannot be reduced to coincidence. They point to a culture that did not fracture under pressure, but bent and adapted while remaining itself. A culture that found ways to carry memory safely through upheaval. What makes this continuity extraordinary is not only its length, but its quality. It was not maintained through rigid preservation or resistance to change. That kind of rigidity often leads to collapse. Instead, continuity was achieved through flexibility anchored in principle, core values, respect for land, balance, responsibility, and relationship remained stable even as practices evolved. This balance between stability and adaptation required constant effort. Continuity was not passive. It had to be actively maintained through teaching, ceremony, and daily practice. Each generation inherited not only knowledge, but the duty to care for it. Forgetting was not inevitable. It was preventable through attention. The absence of writing made this responsibility even greater. Without external storage, memory lived within people and places. This meant that knowledge could not be outsourced. It had to be embodied. Stories had to be told. Songs had to be sung. Paths had to be walked. Continuity depended on use. This also meant that culture was inseparable from life itself. There was no point at which one could step outside of it. Every action, how food was gathered, how disputes were resolved, how children were raised, reinforced continuity. Culture was not something people had, it was something they did. Colonial disruption tested this continuity in unprecedented ways. Violence, displacement, disease, and imposed systems attempted to sever the connection between people and land. Languages were suppressed, ceremonies were outlawed. Children were removed from their communities. By all historical precedent, such pressures should have resulted in total cultural collapse. And yet, continuity persisted in fragments at first, carried quietly, often in secret. Stories survived in whispers, practices adapted to new constraints. Memory went underground, waiting for conditions where it could surface again. Even when people were physically separated from their land, the land remained present in memory and identity. This survival was not miraculous. It was the result of deep-rooted resilience built over tens of thousands of years. Culture that had already survived ice ages, floods, and ecological transformation had developed tools for endurance that extended beyond any single crisis. Today, when elders speak languages that have been spoken on the same land for thousands of years, continuity becomes tangible. When ceremonies are renewed, when songlines are remembered, when place names retain ancient meaning, the abstract idea of deep time becomes lived reality. This continuity forces a reconsideration of what it means for a culture to be old. Age is often associated with obsolescence, but here, age correlates with adaptability. Longevity is not a sign of stagnation, but of wisdom accumulated through experience. It also challenges the notion that progress requires rupture with the past. In many modern narratives, advancement is framed as replacement, new technologies replacing old, new values displacing tradition. This story suggests a different possibility, that growth can occur through integration rather than erasure. The longest unbroken line is not straight. It twists, bends, and sometimes nearly disappears from view. But it does not break. Its strength lies not in visibility, but in continuity of care. To grasp the scale of 50,000 years is to recognize how brief most human endeavors are by comparison. It is to understand that endurance on this scale requires a worldview fundamentally different from one oriented toward rapid expansion or short-term gain. This culture endured because it aligned itself with rhythms older and larger than human ambition. It understood that survival depended not on outpacing change, but on learning how to live within it. In recognizing this continuity, we are not merely acknowledging a remarkable historical fact. We are encountering a different model of civilization, one measured not by monuments or conquests, but by the ability to remain human across deep time. The longest unbroken line is not a relic of the past. It is a living presence, reminding us that history does not always move by replacement. Sometimes it moves by remembering. For tens of thousands of years, the world had turned without interruption. Seasons shifted, coastlines changed, animals came and went, but the rhythm of life endured. Then, suddenly, another world arrived. Not gradually, not quietly, but with an unfamiliar weight that the land itself seemed unable to absorb. The meeting of these two worlds was not marked by a single moment, but by a slow, uneven unfolding. One side unable to see the other clearly, both moving under assumptions that could not coexist. When Europeans first appeared on the horizon, they did not see an ancient culture refined by deep time. They saw absence. No cities, no fences, no fields laid out in familiar patterns. To their eyes, the land looked empty, unused, waiting. What they could not perceive was the density of meaning beneath their feet, the stories embedded in the ground, the laws encoded in movement, the relationships maintained through memory rather than structures. This misunderstanding was foundational, and it shaped everything that followed. Where one worldview understood land as a living entity bound by responsibility, the other saw it as property, a resource to be claimed and improved. Where one culture understood law as relational and contextual, the other understood law as something written, enforced, and hierarchical. These were not minor differences. They were incompatible ways of existing in the world. The first encounters were often cautious, sometimes curious. There were moments of exchange, of observation, of tentative coexistence. But beneath these moments lay a growing imbalance of power. The newcomers carried technologies of extraction, warfare, and administration that had been forged in centuries of conflict elsewhere. They also carried a certainty, an unshakable belief in their own superiority, reinforced by religion, empire, and written authority. The ancient culture they encountered did not recognize this certainty as strength. It appeared, instead, as recklessness. The newcomers did not read the land. They did not understand its limits. They moved quickly, cleared areas without regard for consequence, disrupted systems they did not know existed. What they interpreted as progress was, from another perspective, destruction born of ignorance. Communication between the two worlds was fragile. Language barriers obscured meaning. Gestures were misread. Silence was interpreted as emptiness rather than restraint. Sacred places were entered without understanding. Boundaries maintained through story and memory were invisible to those who recognized only lines drawn on paper. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this encounter was that it was not inevitable. It was shaped by choices, by the refusal to see, to listen, to question assumptions. The ancient culture did not lack intelligence or organization. It lacked recognition within a framework that valued only what resembled itself. As settlement expanded, misunderstanding hardened into policy. Land was claimed under doctrines that declared it empty if it was not farmed or fenced. This erased not only ownership, but existence itself. Culture that had endured for 50,000 years was rendered invisible by definitions it had no role in creating. Disease followed settlement, spreading faster than any human intention. Communities were devastated by illnesses they had no immunity against. Loss came not only through violence, but through invisibility, through systems that failed to recognize suffering as legitimate. The scale of disruption was unlike anything the culture had faced before. Traditional systems of movement were broken as land was enclosed. Song lines were severed. Ceremonial gatherings became difficult or impossible. Knowledge tied to place began to fray as access was denied. Displacement was not only physical, it was epistemological. Ways of knowing were undermined by ways of controlling. Yet even in this imbalance, resistance took many forms. Some were overt, marked by conflict and defiance. Others were quiet, almost invisible. Knowledge was hidden. Stories were told in secret. Practices adapted to survive under constraint. Continuity did not vanish. It retreated, waiting. The failure of understanding was not mutual. One side had the power to impose its worldview. The other bore the consequences. To describe this encounter as a meeting of equals would be dishonest. It was an asymmetrical collision, shaped by denial rather than dialogue. What makes this moment especially painful in the context of deep time is its suddenness. 50,000 years of continuity met disruption within a few generations. Systems refined over millennia were dismissed as primitive. Knowledge proven by endurance was replaced by theories that did not survive even a century without causing damage. This encounter did not only fracture land and community, it fractured time. The ancient culture's relationship with the past was disrupted by false narratives that dismissed its history. Continuity was challenged not because it failed, but because it was attacked. And yet, even here, the story does not end in disappearance. It bends. The same adaptability that allowed survival through ice ages now faced an entirely different threat. One not from nature, but from another version of humanity. Understanding this moment requires resisting simplification. It was not a clash between progress and stagnation. It was a collision between two ways of understanding existence, one grounded in dominance, the other in relationship. The tragedy lies not only in what was lost, but in what could have been learned. This was the moment when two worlds failed to understand each other. One arrived believing it was bringing history. The other already carried more history than the newcomer could imagine. And in that failure of recognition, a wound opened, one that would shape everything that followed. What followed the initial encounters was not a single catastrophe, but a slow, grinding unraveling of balance. Ancient system, built on continuity, memory, and relationship, was forced into collision with a worldview that measured success through control, extraction, and permanence. The damage did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly at first, then relentlessly, until the weight became impossible to ignore. Land was the first casualty. Places that had been cared for through story and responsibility were redefined as assets. Fences cut across ceremonial paths that had existed for thousands of years. Rivers were diverted. Forests were cleared. Fire, once used with precision and restraint, was suppressed or unleashed without understanding. Ecological systems that had been shaped gently over millennia were thrown into imbalance within decades. For the people whose lives were bound to this land, the consequences were devastating. When access to country was denied, it was not merely displacement. It was the severing of identity. Knowledge tied to specific places could not be practiced. Ceremonies could not be completed. Responsibilities passed down for countless generations became impossible to fulfill. This was not just loss of territory, it was loss of meaning. Violence accompanied this transformation. Sometimes it was overt and brutal. Sometimes it was bureaucratic and distant. Communities were pushed aside, broken apart, or confined to unfamiliar spaces. Resistance was met with force. Survival increasingly meant adaptation under coercion rather than choice. Disease compounded the damage. Illness spread rapidly through populations with no immunity, erasing elders who carried irreplaceable knowledge. Each death was not only a personal tragedy, but a rupture in the chain of memory. Stories went untold. Songs fell silent. Languages weakened as their speakers disappeared. Children were separated from families and communities, taken under policies that claimed protection while enforcing erasure. They were taught to forget who they were, to abandon language, story, and identity. This was not collateral damage. It was intentional disruption of continuity, a direct assault on the mechanisms that had allowed culture to survive for 50,000 years. Traditional governance systems were dismissed as non-existent or illegitimate. Laws rooted in relationship were replaced by laws rooted in ownership. Authority shifted from elders and knowledge holders to distant institutions that neither understood nor respected local reality. The fabric of social life was strained to breaking point. Yet even as this ancient balance fractured, it did not vanish completely. What endured did so under immense pressure. Knowledge adapted again, but now under conditions it had never evolved to face. Practices were concealed, stories were encoded more deeply. Memory learned how to survive invisibly. This survival came at a cost. Trauma accumulated across generations. Disconnection from land created wounds that could not be healed through adaptation alone. The loss was not only cultural, but psychological and spiritual. A system designed for continuity was forced into fragmentation. The breaking of balance also extended beyond human communities. Environmental degradation followed patterns of extraction unfamiliar to the land. Soil exhausted, water polluted, species declined. The consequences of ignoring long-held ecological knowledge became increasingly visible, affecting settlers and newcomers, as well as those displaced. Ironically, some of the very practices once dismissed as primitive would later be recognized as essential. Controlled burning, sustainable harvesting, and deep ecological awareness resurfaced in scientific discourse, often stripped of their cultural origins. The land, it seemed, remembered what people tried to forget. This period cannot be understood as a simple story of victimhood or defeat. It is a story of endurance under conditions designed to erase. Continuity did not remain intact, but neither was it extinguished. Fractured, scattered, and endured in pieces, waiting for space to reassemble. The breaking of balance was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, of refusal to listen, to recognize value beyond familiar forms. That refusal left scars that remain visible today, in communities, in landscapes, in unresolved histories. To acknowledge this rupture is not to dwell in guilt or despair. It is to understand the cost of misunderstanding at a civilizational scale. When one way of knowing is imposed over another, the loss is not confined to those silenced. It diminishes everyone. This moment marks the deepest wound in the long story of continuity. Not because the culture failed, but because it was forcibly interrupted. And yet, even here, something endured. Beneath the damage, memory remained alive, quiet, persistent, and waiting. The ancient balance was broken, but it was not destroyed. It survived in fragments, carried forward by those who refused to let 50,000 years of knowledge vanish entirely. And in that refusal lies the foundation for what comes next. After the rupture, survival took on a different meaning. It was no longer only about food, shelter, and movement across land. It became about memory itself, about keeping something alive when the conditions that once sustained it had been deliberately dismantled. Survival moved inward. It became quieter, more fragile, and at the same time, more determined. For a culture shaped over tens of thousands of years to endure through relationship with place, being torn from that place created a kind of existential threat. And yet, endurance did not cease. It transformed. When access to land was restricted or denied, memory learned to travel without it. Stories once tied to specific locations were held within people, carried across distances they were never meant to cross. Knowledge adapted, not because it was meant to, but because it had to. This was survival beyond survival, the persistence of identity when the material foundations of life were under constant attack. Elders became living archives, holding stories, language, and law within themselves, even as the world around them demanded forgetting. Teaching often happened in fragments, in moments stolen from oversight, in whispers rather than ceremonies. What had once been shared openly now required protection. Language, one of the most vulnerable carriers of culture, suffered greatly. Many languages fell silent as speakers were lost or forced into systems that punished their use. But even as languages weakened, fragments endured, words, rhythms, ways of speaking that carried worldview within them. In some cases, a single speaker became the last guardian of an entire linguistic universe. Survival, then, meant remembering even when there was no one left to speak to. Ceremony adapted as well. Large gatherings became impossible in many places, but smaller acts persisted. A song sung quietly, a story told at night, a gesture repeated exactly as it had been taught. These acts may have appeared insignificant from the outside, but they carried enormous weight. They were acts of refusal, proof that continuity had not been fully severed. Children grew up navigating two worlds. One demanded conformity, silence, and forgetting. The other lived beneath the surface, carried by family, memory, and intuition. Learning became layered and complex. Knowledge was passed on cautiously, sometimes delayed until safety allowed. Survival required discernment, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. This period reshaped identity in painful ways. To connection from land created a sense of loss that could not be easily articulated. Trauma accumulated, passed down not through story, but through absence. The effects were not immediate alone. They echoed across generations, shaping relationships, health, and self-understanding. And yet, within this pain, resilience persisted. Not as an abstract concept, but as daily practice. People adapted to imposed systems while retaining inner frameworks of meaning. They learned to survive in environments that did not recognize them, while holding on to identities that those environments sought to erase. Resistance did not always look like opposition. Often, it looked like continuity. Like refusing to let a name be forgotten, like insisting on telling a story exactly as it had been told before, even when it seemed to have no place in the modern world, like teaching a child a word that authorities said should no longer exist. This form of survival was exhausting. It required constant vigilance. It came with grief, anger, and profound fatigue. But it also carried purpose. Memory was not preserved out of nostalgia. It was preserved because it mattered, because it held a different way of being human, one worth carrying forward even when the future seemed uncertain. Over time, cracks appeared in the systems that enforced erasure. The certainty of imposed superiority began to weaken. Voices once silenced began to be heard, though often imperfectly and late. Space slowly emerged for cultural expression that had long been suppressed. Survival beyond survival meant being ready for that moment, being able to remember when remembering became possible again. The fragments held through generations could begin to reconnect. Languages could be revived. Ceremonies could be renewed. Stories could be told openly, not as relics, but as living knowledge. This process was not simple or complete. Loss could not be undone. Some knowledge was gone forever, carried away by those who had no chance to pass it on. But what remained was enough to rebuild continuity, not as it once was, but as it could now be. In this sense, endurance was not about returning to a frozen past. It was about carrying the essence of a culture forward into a changed world. Survival beyond survival meant transformation without erasure. It meant allowing new realities to exist without abandoning ancient foundations. The quiet persistence of memory through the darkest period of disruption stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Not because it was heroic in a dramatic sense, but because it was human in the deepest sense. It was the refusal to let meaning vanish, even when meaning had been stripped of space to live. This chapter of the story is heavy, but it is not the end. It marks the moment when survival became an act of intention rather than instinct, when endurance was no longer guaranteed by balance with land, but by choice, care, and resilience carried within people themselves. What endured through this period was not just culture, but the idea that continuity matters. That 50,000 years of memory is not something that disappears simply because a few generations are forced to forget. It waits, it adapts, and when conditions allow, it begins to speak again, even in the face of displacement, disruption, and loss. One remarkable truth endured. Knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years was not easily extinguished. It survived not only in stories, ceremonies, and songs, but in practical understanding of the land and its rhythms. This knowledge, refined through generations of careful observation and lived experience, proved to be astonishingly sophisticated, an ecological intelligence far ahead of its time, capable of guiding humans through landscapes that challenge survival at every turn. What modern science often dismisses as traditional or primitive knowledge now reveals itself as deeply informed by observation, experimentation, and reflection over millennia. Consider fire management. For outsiders arriving centuries later, fire might appear dangerous, destructive, or uncontrolled. Yet the practice of deliberate burning had evolved into a complex system designed to sustain life on the land. Fires were lit strategically to encourage the growth of certain plants, to clear underbrush without destroying habitats, and to attract or herd animals for hunting. Different seasons, winds, and soil types required precise understanding. It was not guesswork. It was an adaptive strategy owned over thousands of generations, with a subtlety that continues to impress contemporary ecologists. Each burn was a form of landscape engineering, low impact yet profoundly effective, promoting biodiversity and preventing catastrophic wildfires that modern communities now struggle to control. Plants, too, were studied and utilized with care. Knowledge of edible and medicinal species was extensive. Some plants required precise preparation to neutralize toxins. Others could only be harvested at specific times to ensure sustainability. Knowledge about flowering cycles, seed dispersal, and animal interactions was embedded in oral histories and stories, encoded in ways that ensured accurate transmission across generations. These were not isolated observations. They represented a sophisticated understanding of ecosystem dynamics that allowed humans to live in harmony with their environment rather than attempting to dominate or alter it indiscriminately. Animal behavior formed another domain of extraordinary understanding. People knew migration patterns, breeding cycles, and feeding habits. They understood predator-prey dynamics, recognizing which species could be hunted safely at what times, and which required protection for ecological balance. These practices reflected a recognition of interdependence that modern science now identifies as essential for sustainability. Survival depended not on overexploitation, but on careful management, a form of ecological intelligence grounded in respect, observation, and experience beyond practical survival. Knowledge was also encoded philosophically. Principles of restraint, reciprocity, and respect for life were not abstract morals, they were survival strategies validated by millennia of practice. Taking too much, harming sacred places, or ignoring natural patterns carried immediate consequences. Culture and ecology were intertwined. Ethical frameworks were inseparable from environmental awareness. Knowledge was not just descriptive, it was prescriptive, teaching people how to act in ways that ensured continuity for both community and ecosystem. This knowledge extended into the social realm as well. Mobility across the continent required intimate understanding of water sources, terrain, and seasonal changes. Songlines mapped the land in ways that merged geography with memory and morality. Elders guided travelers, sharing encoded information through stories, songs, and ceremonies. Knowledge was distributed across the population, ensuring redundancy and resilience. No single loss could erase it entirely. Each generation was a custodian, carrying forward lessons refined over tens of thousands of years. What is striking is how these systems anticipated concepts that modern ecology has only formalized in recent decades. Controlled burning aligns with prescribed fire programs. Understanding seasonal cycles parallels phenology studies. Knowledge of sustainable harvesting and species management mirrors modern conservation strategies. These are not coincidences, they reflect careful, iterative learning embedded in everyday life. An empirical science practiced for survival rather than prestige. This ecological intelligence was inseparable from culture. Spiritual beliefs, stories, and rituals reinforced practical knowledge. Sacred sites often corresponded to areas of ecological importance. Ceremonies coincided with natural cycles, reinforcing awareness of seasonal shifts, breeding patterns, and plant availability. Knowledge was transmitted in a way that intertwined practicality with meaning, ensuring that even abstract principles had real-world application. In addition, knowledge was dynamic. It adapted to environmental change over millennia. Droughts, floods, and shifts in species distributions were incorporated into stories and memory. Innovations were layered upon traditional practices rather than replacing them entirely. Continuity was preserved because knowledge was flexible, relational, and reinforced socially. Learning was ongoing, not fixed, and survival depended on this adaptability. The preservation and transmission of such knowledge required social structures that supported learning, observation, and accountability. Children were trained not only through instruction, but through participation. Mistakes could be corrected in real time, and insights were shared collectively. Knowledge was never isolated. It belonged to the community and the land. Responsibility for maintaining it extended across families, clans, and generations. Modern observers sometimes fail to appreciate this knowledge because it is embodied rather than written. It does not appear on paper or in databases. Instead, it lives in practices, relationships, and memory. Yet the precision and sophistication of these systems rival modern scientific methods. Observations were repeated, tested, and verified across generations. Results were applied and refined. Knowledge was empirical, adaptive, and cumulative. Even under the pressures of colonization, displacement, and disruption, these forms of understanding persisted. Skills, stories, and practices survived in subtle, often hidden ways. Some knowledge lay dormant, waiting for conditions to allow its renewal. Others were modified, integrated into new contexts, but never entirely lost. Survival of culture depended as much on the ability to carry knowledge quietly and protect it as on physical endurance. In many ways, this ecological intelligence represents one of the most impressive human achievements. It demonstrates that sustainability is not a modern invention. It shows that knowledge can endure across tens of thousands of years when it is deeply connected to observation, responsibility, and relationship. This knowledge was not abstract or theoretical. It was alive, practical, and intimately tied to survival. Recognizing this challenges assumptions about what intelligence looks like and what survival requires. It suggests that enduring wisdom often lies not in conquest or accumulation, but in listening, observing, and adapting. It also emphasizes the interconnectedness of humans and the natural world, an understanding that modern societies are only beginning to rediscover. What persisted through all these centuries was more than survival. It was a system of understanding that allowed humans to thrive in landscapes that could easily have been inhospitable. Knowledge and practice, embedded in culture, ensured continuity. It was a living science carried across generations, encoded in story, song, ritual, and careful observation of the world. This knowledge, nearly lost under external pressures, now stands as a testament to human adaptability, intelligence, and respect for the world. It reveals that the culture which endured for 50,000 years was not only resilient socially and spiritually, but ecologically sophisticated in ways that continue to inspire and inform contemporary approaches to environmental stewardship. To stand in the presence of a culture that has endured 50,000 years is to confront questions that go beyond archaeology, biology, or ecology. It is to confront questions about intelligence, time, and the very meaning of progress. Modern frameworks often measure human achievement by accumulation, wealth, territory, technology, or power. Yet here is a civilization that has lasted longer than any empire, outlasted many written traditions, and survived environmental upheavals, social disruption, and attempts at erasure. Its measure of intelligence is not conquest or speed, but endurance and adaptation. When we reconsider intelligence in this context, it becomes something broader and deeper than problem solving in abstract terms. It is relational. It is the capacity to live harmoniously within complex systems of life. Intelligence here is not expressed through individual ingenuity alone, but through the careful transmission of knowledge across generations. It is embedded in the ability to observe, to remember, to act with restraint, and to foresee consequences not only for oneself, but for one's descendants, community, and land. This challenges our modern obsession with linear progress. We often assume that civilization must advance, that each generation should surpass the last in material or technological terms, but endurance requires a different mindset. It values stability over novelty, depth over breadth, and relationship over accumulation. In such a framework, wisdom is not measured by what is created, but by what is preserved, balanced, and integrated. Survival itself is a form of intelligence, one that requires foresight, humility, and restraint. Time is experienced differently in this worldview. The past is not a distant point to be studied from afar. It is present, alive in stories, songlines, and the land itself. Memory is active, guiding decision-making, social interaction, and environmental management. Future generations are considered partners in ongoing practice. Decisions are not made for immediate gain, but with the awareness that consequences ripple across decades, centuries, and even millennia. This long horizon fosters patience, careful observation, and deep moral reflection. Progress in this context is measured not by dominance, but by the sustainability of knowledge and the persistence of relationships. A generation that depletes its resources, severs its ties to the land, or disrupts social harmony is not advancing. It is eroding the foundations of survival. Conversely, those who act in alignment with ecological rhythms, social obligations, and moral principles are, in a profound sense, highly intelligent. Their success is measured in continuity, not accumulation. This perspective also reframes failure. In modern frameworks, failure is often immediate, visible, and quantified. In this deep time culture, failure is understood in relational terms: imbalance with land, disregard for ancestral law, or disruption of communal trust. Learning from failure is not optional. It is essential. The stakes are absorbed into story, song, and ritual, ensuring that memory strengthens rather than weakens with time. Ethics and intelligence are inseparable in this system. To act wisely is to act ethically. To disregard obligation to land community, or ancestors is not merely immoral. It is a practical threat to survival. Knowledge and morality are fused, creating a form of intelligence that is holistic, adaptive, and enduring. Modern civilization, with its emphasis on rapid change and technological supremacy, often undervalues such intelligence. Systems that prioritize immediate results, conquest, and accumulation frequently fail to recognize that long-term survival requires balance, observation, and restraint. 50,000 years of cultural endurance offer a model for thinking differently about what it means to be intelligent, to progress, and to thrive. Philosophically, this endurance also redefines human purpose. If intelligence is measured by longevity and relational understanding, rather than by conquest or invention, then the highest achievement is continuity. The ability to remain human, ethical, and aware through immense spans of time. Civilization is not defined by monuments, armies, or records, but by memory carried faithfully across generations. This perspective invites reflection on the modern human condition. Societies that dominate quickly often pay the price in ecological collapse, social fragmentation, or cultural amnesia. In contrast, a system oriented toward endurance fosters stability, resilience, and wisdom. It asks whether humanity's goals should focus on rapid expansion or on listening, learning, and adapting over the long arc of time. The culture that endured through ice ages, rising seas, and colonization demonstrates that intelligence is relational, cumulative, and moral. It teaches that survival is not only a biological imperative, but a social, ecological, and ethical one. Knowledge must be shared, action must be responsible, and the land must be respected. Intelligence is measured in the ability to sustain life, not just for oneself, but for countless generations to come. Time itself becomes a teacher. In a worldview shaped over tens of thousands of years, impatience is dangerous. Immediate gratification is irrelevant. Decisions are evaluated across decades, centuries, and millennia. This long-term perspective encourages foresight, care, and the cultivation of relationships that can withstand disruption. Progress is reimagined as stability, continuity, and adaptability rather than expansion. Intelligence is measured by survival, not accumulation. Morality is intertwined with practicality. Knowledge is not a commodity, but a responsibility. This ancient worldview challenges modern assumptions about what it means to advance, to innovate, and to understand the world. To look at this culture is to see a different model of human achievement, one that emphasizes listening over domination, patience over speed, and endurance over spectacle. Its lessons are philosophical as much as practical. They ask whether modern civilization has mistaken noise for wisdom, speed for insight, and accumulation for intelligence. In the end, rethinking intelligence, progress, and time in light of 50,000 years of continuity forces a confrontation with our own assumptions. It asks whether humanity's highest measure should be conquest and growth, or whether true mastery lies in the capacity to endure thoughtfully, ethically, and relationally. It invites reflection on what it truly means to be human, capable of carrying memory, meaning, and responsibility across deep time. Even after centuries of disruption, displacement, and cultural suppression, the voices of this ancient culture refused to disappear. They persisted quietly, in subtle acts, in stories whispered to children, in ceremonies performed in hidden spaces, and in songs carried across generations. These voices were neither loud nor public in the way outsiders might expect, yet they were powerful, resilient, and unbroken. They carried knowledge, identity, and memory across a landscape that had been forcibly altered, ensuring that the continuity forged over 50,000 years remained alive. Language was one of the primary vessels for these voices. Despite efforts to suppress it, words, phrases, and dialects survived in homes, in families, and among elders who acted as living repositories of memory. These languages were not mere tools for communication. They were encoded systems of knowledge, carrying information about land, seasons, social law, and ecological relationships. Even a single word could contain centuries of understanding. To lose the language was not only to lose communication, it was to lose a framework for perceiving and interacting with the world. Stories, too, were preserved with care. Oral narratives encoded not only history, but also law, ethics, and environmental knowledge. They were more than entertainment. They were instruction manuals for life, guiding behavior, teaching respect, and ensuring survival. In times of extreme disruption, stories were shared discreetly, sometimes orally within small family units, at times passed along in coded forms to protect their integrity. These narratives maintained continuity, even when the physical spaces in which they had been anchored were lost or transformed. Ceremony became a method of resistance and preservation. Even when access to traditional lands was restricted, rituals adapted to new spaces and circumstances. Ceremonial practices, songs, dances, and symbolic acts functioned as living memory, reconnecting participants to ancestors, land, and shared laws. Each performance reaffirmed identity and reinforced social cohesion, ensuring that culture was not merely remembered, but lived, even in adversity. Through ceremony, memory was made tangible, and continuity became visible in action. Elders played a critical role in preserving these voices. They were guardians of knowledge, responsible for guiding younger generations in the ways of the world, ensuring that lessons survived despite social, political, and environmental disruption. Their role was both practical and symbolic. They embodied the past, the law, and the land itself. Respect for elders was not ceremonial alone. It was a practical strategy for continuity. Listening to and following their guidance ensured that knowledge could be transmitted accurately across generations. Children grew up navigating multiple realities. One reality imposed by external authorities demanded forgetting and assimilation, while another, quieter reality, required remembering, observing, and learning. This dual experience demanded ingenuity and care, as well as resilience. Learning became an act of survival and resistance, embedding cultural knowledge in new contexts without losing its essence. Through this process, young people became carriers of culture, capable of bridging fractured worlds and reconnecting dispersed communities. Revival efforts in the modern era illustrate the enduring strength of these voices. Languages once thought extinct have been reclaimed. Ceremonies once hidden have been renewed in public spaces. Stories preserved in fragmented form have been reassembled, retranslated, and reintegrated into cultural practice. These efforts demonstrate that continuity does not require perfect preservation. It requires attentive, deliberate care. Even fragmented knowledge, when treated with respect and effort, can blossom into living tradition. This process of cultural revival highlights the interconnectedness of memory, place, and identity. Knowledge cannot be abstracted from context. Songs regain meaning when sung on ancestral land. Stories regain power when connected to ceremonial practice and ecological observation. Language regains vitality when spoken daily, not just recorded. Continuity requires practice, merely acknowledgement. The persistence of voices also underscores the importance of relational understanding. Knowledge is sustained not individually, but collectively. Elders, youth, families, and communities share responsibility for continuity. Memory is distributed, redundant, and resilient precisely because it exists in networks rather than in isolated nodes. Each voice contributes to a larger chorus, ensuring that loss in one area does not equate to disappearance. These living voices also carry moral and philosophical lessons. They demonstrate that endurance is not merely survival. It is an active, deliberate process that requires care, attention, and ethical engagement. They show that culture is not fixed in monuments or texts, but is maintained through practice, relationship, and responsibility. They remind us that knowledge, identity, and continuity are inseparable from action and attentiveness. Modern observers may struggle to perceive the vitality of these voices because they do not always conform to expectations of permanence or visibility. Yet their resilience is evident in the ability of knowledge to adapt, survive, and flourish despite immense pressure. They reveal that culture is not extinguished simply because external structures fail to recognize it. Memory, care, and practice sustain it in ways that defy simplistic measurement. The persistence of these voices also offers a model for thinking about resilience more broadly. Endurance is not about static preservation or resistance to change. It is about flexibility, relationality, and responsiveness. It is about embedding knowledge in practice, ethics, and memory so deeply that even disruptive forces cannot fully erase it. Survival is active, not passive. Continuity is deliberate, not accidental. Through these enduring voices, the ancient culture continues to inform, guide, and inspire. Knowledge carried across generations offers lessons for modern society about sustainable living, relational intelligence, respect for land, and ethical responsibility. These lessons are not relics. They are alive, relevant, and urgent. They demonstrate that wisdom accumulated over tens of thousands of years has practical application today, not only for cultural continuity, but for ecological and social sustainability. In the end, these voices are more than echoes of the past. They are living presence. They connect people to land, to ancestors, and to one another. They embody continuity, resilience, and the deep intelligence required to endure across 50,000 years of change. Listening to them is not an act of nostalgia. It is an encounter with knowledge that has survived, adapted, and remained vital despite centuries of challenge. 50,000 years of continuity carry lessons that extend far beyond the boundaries of any one culture or generation. When we look back across such spans of time, the human experience becomes not just a record of survival, but a mirror reflecting possibilities for how we might live now. The people who walked these lands, who maintained their knowledge, memory, and identity across millennia, offer a profound example of how humans can relate to the world, to each other, and to time itself. Their example challenges assumptions about mastery, control, and progress, inviting reflection on what it means to live responsibly in a fragile and interconnected world. One of the most striking lessons is the value of patience and long-term thinking. In contemporary societies, decisions are often measured by immediate outcomes. Policy, economics, and technology operate on short horizons, frequently ignoring consequences that unfold over decades or centuries. In contrast, the ancient culture of this continent approached life with a temporal depth few modern systems can match. Decisions were informed not only by the present, but by memory stretching back thousands of generations, and by consideration for those yet to come. To move across the land, harvest a resource, or alter a landscape was never an isolated act. It was evaluated in terms of continuity, balance, and ethical responsibility. There is a lesson here for our age. Foresight and attentiveness are not optional. They are essential to the survival of societies, ecosystems, and cultures alike. Another lesson lies in relational understanding. These people viewed themselves not as separate from the environment, but as participants within it. Every action was contextual, every decision intertwined with the well-being of land, animals, and community. Modern humanity often treats nature as a commodity or a backdrop for human activity. The deep time culture teaches us that knowledge and ethics are inseparable. Respect for the land is not sentimental. It is practical and ethical. To take more than needed, to act without attention, is to disrupt balance. This approach encourages modern societies to reconsider the foundations of sustainability, demonstrating that environmental stewardship has always been possible when observation and care are central to human action. Continuity also offers lessons in resilience. Across millennia, this culture survived ice ages, rising seas, ecological shifts, and social disruptions. Its endurance was not predicated on dominance, rapid innovation, or the accumulation of power. It was predicated on adaptability grounded in principle. Flexibility, rooted in long-term ethical frameworks, allowed knowledge to persist even when circumstances changed dramatically. For modern societies facing climate change, global instability, and resource depletion, this approach provides a blueprint. Resilience arises not from control alone, but from relational awareness, anticipation of change, and cultivation of adaptive knowledge that can persist across generations. The persistence of memory through oral traditions, songlines, and ceremonial practice illustrates another critical principle: that knowledge is relational and embodied. Information is most robust when it is integrated into practice, responsibility, and community. Modern technological systems store knowledge externally, often disconnected from the people who use it or from the ecosystems it impacts. By contrast, in this ancient culture, knowledge was inseparable from human action, ethical frameworks, and place. The lesson is clear. The value of knowledge increases when it is lived, when it is connected to the world it describes, and when it carries accountability across generations. Ethics emerges as inseparable from survival. In this framework, intelligence is relational and morality is practical. Decisions that might appear minor: when to burn a patch of land, how to harvest a plant, how to distribute resources, carry moral weight precisely because they affect continuity. Modern societies often separate ethics from practice, relegating morality to abstract principles or regulatory codes. The deep time example suggests a different model. Ethics is lived through observation, attentiveness, and action. Survival and morality are not distinct, they are interwoven. The cultural emphasis on communal responsibility also offers insight. Social cohesion was maintained not through coercion, but through shared understanding, obligation, and trust. Every member of the community carried responsibility for memory, land, and law. In modern contexts, where individualism often dominates, this perspective reminds us that continuity and resilience are strengthened by networks of care, shared knowledge, and mutual accountability. Societies thrive when responsibility is distributed, embedded in relationships, and reinforced through cultural practice. Importantly, this culture demonstrates that continuity does not require stagnation. Adaptation occurred constantly, yet the core principles of identity, ethical behavior, and ecological awareness persisted. This shows that progress and endurance are not mutually exclusive. Innovation is not inherently destructive. It becomes destructive only when divorced from relational understanding, ethical responsibility, and awareness of long-term consequences. Modern humanity can draw from this lesson as it grapples with rapid technological and environmental change. There is also a lesson in humility. Humans who walk across continents for 50,000 years develop a profound awareness of the limits of individual and collective power. The long-term culture demonstrates that mastery is not the same as control. True mastery lies in the ability to observe, listen, adapt, and maintain balance. For contemporary societies that often measure success in conquest, accumulation, or domination, this perspective is both challenging and instructive. It asks us to reconsider what it means to succeed, to act wisely, and to sustain life across deep time. Finally, the survival of culture through extreme disruption teaches a lesson about the power of memory and intentional preservation. Even under colonization, displacement, and social disruption, knowledge survived in subtle, persistent ways. Stories were told quietly, language was spoken in secret. Ceremonies continued wherever possible. This teaches modern humans that continuity depends not only on favorable conditions, but on deliberate care, attentiveness, and action. Memory, identity, and practice must be actively preserved, particularly under threat. Taken together, these lessons suggest that 50,000 years of continuity is not merely an anthropological curiosity. It is a guide for living in a fragile world. It encourages foresight, relational awareness, adaptability, ethical action, communal responsibility, and humility. It demonstrates that human intelligence is best measured not by rapid accumulation or domination, but by the ability to endure thoughtfully, to preserve knowledge, and to act with care across generations. This deep time perspective reframes the way modern societies might approach environmental, social, and ethical challenges. It suggests that solutions grounded in observation, memory, and relationship are more sustainable than those built solely on extraction, speed, or control. It emphasizes the importance of continuity over novelty, balance over conquest, and care over convenience. Above all, the ancient culture teaches that the past is not separate from the present. The knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years remains relevant, providing guidance for contemporary life. Listening to these voices, observing their strategies, and understanding their principles offers not nostalgia, but practical insight. It reminds us that survival is not merely a biological imperative. It is ethical, relational, and deliberate. It demonstrates that continuity matters, and that human intelligence is most profound when measured by the capacity to endure responsibly across deep time. In the end, 50,000 years of memory and adaptation offer a mirror to our own civilization. They invite reflection on how we might align ourselves with the rhythms of the world, honor responsibility to the future, and cultivate knowledge that survives beyond our immediate lifetimes. The lessons of this enduring culture are both subtle and profound. They challenge modern assumptions, redefine intelligence, and illuminate pathways toward a more thoughtful, sustainable, and ethically grounded existence in a fragile world. As the narrative approaches its culmination, the story shifts from reflection to vision. The people whose culture has endured for 50,000 years offer more than lessons about survival and adaptation. They offer a glimpse into a kind of future shaped by memory, continuity, and relationship. This is a future that does not rely solely on rapid innovation, accumulation, or conquest, but on understanding, restraint, and care. The oldest culture in the world demonstrates that longevity is possible when humans act with awareness of time, responsibility to others, and respect for the living systems that sustain them. To imagine the oldest future is to recognize that continuity is not passive. It does not happen by accident or by force of circumstance alone. It is an active process requiring attention, intention, and deliberate action across generations. Every decision, from how land is used to how knowledge is passed on, contributes to the preservation or disruption of the system. The longest unbroken cultural line demonstrates that true endurance is achieved not by domination, but by alignment with place, with community, and with the cycles of life itself. In this perspective, the landscape is more than a resource. It is a partner, a repository of memory, and a guide. Each river, hill, and forest contains lessons encoded over millennia. To move across it responsibly is to participate in a conversation with the past, to honor obligations inherited from ancestors, and to anticipate the needs of those who will follow. Human intelligence is measured not only in problem solving or technology, but in the ability to perceive patterns, recognize consequences, and act ethically within complex systems. The oldest future also emphasizes relational thinking. Identity is not defined in isolation, but through connection to family, community, and environment. The culture teaches that sustainability, both social and ecological, depends on these interwoven relationships. When human action respects these connections, continuity is possible. When it ignores them, imbalance and disruption follow. Modern civilization, often focused on immediate gain, can learn from this relational perspective. The health of society and the environment are inseparable, and understanding this relationship is essential for long-term survival. Knowledge, in the oldest future, is living. It is not a static record of the past, but an active guide for present and future behavior. Oral traditions, songlines, and ceremonial practices function not merely as historical documentation, but as instruction for navigating the world. Lessons are encoded in memory, rhythm, and action, making them adaptable to changing conditions while retaining their core truths. This approach suggests a model for human understanding that integrates observation, experience, and ethical reflection, one that remains robust across generations. This vision also reframes progress. Unlike the modern conception, which often equates advancement with speed, technology, or accumulation, the oldest future measures progress by endurance, adaptability, and ethical integrity. A society that survives catastrophes, maintains knowledge, and sustains balance with its environment is making profound progress, even if it appears modest or invisible to outsiders. Continuity, rather than conquest, becomes the ultimate metric of success. One of the most striking aspects of this perspective is the emphasis on patience. Decisions are evaluated not for their immediate benefits, but for their long-term effects. Human life is understood as part of a continuum, extending backward to ancestors and forward to descendants. This temporal depth fosters careful observation, foresight, and reflection. The ability to act with patience and attentiveness becomes a defining feature of intelligence and wisdom. The oldest future also highlights the integration of ethics into every domain of life. Actions are never neutral. They carry consequences for the land, the community, and future generations. Ethical behavior is not imposed externally, but emerges from understanding and respect for the systems humans inhabit. Knowledge and morality are intertwined, ensuring that survival and flourishing are inseparable from care and responsibility. Cultural memory plays a central role in this vision. The transmission of knowledge across generations ensures that wisdom is not lost and that lessons from the past continue to inform decision-making. This continuity allows for resilience in the face of disruption, enabling adaptation without losing the guiding principles that sustain identity and relationship with the land. Memory becomes both anchor and compass, providing stability while guiding movement through uncertainty. Language, song, and story serve as vessels for the oldest future. They carry information, ethics, and identity across time, ensuring that generations remain connected to ancestral wisdom. These forms of transmission reinforce relational awareness, communal responsibility, and ecological intelligence. Even when physical landscapes change or communities are dispersed, these practices allow culture to endure and guide future action. In addition, this perspective recognizes the necessity of humility. Humans are not masters of the environment, but participants within it. Success is measured not by domination, but by alignment with ecological and social systems. Oldest future demonstrates that true mastery comes from observation, care, and balanced qualities that ensure survival not for a single generation, but across millennia. Modern societies often perceive time as a linear path, marked by rapid change and immediate outcomes. Oldest future presents a counterpoint. Time is layered, relational, and cyclical. Understanding past patterns, learning from ancestral experience, and anticipating future needs are essential for sustainable action. This deep time perspective encourages reflection on the consequences of short-term thinking and the value of cumulative knowledge. Finally, the oldest future emphasizes hope grounded in continuity. Despite centuries of disruption, displacement, and attempts at erasure, culture has persisted. Memory, knowledge, and practice have survived through attentive care, adaptability, and resilience. This endurance demonstrates that the human spirit, when aligned with ethical and ecological understanding, is capable of sustaining itself even under extraordinary pressure. Continuity is possible, not as a passive inheritance, but as an active engagement with life, responsibility, and relationship. In imagining this future, the land, people, and memory are inseparable. The oldest culture teaches that the future is not something to be imposed, but something to be nurtured. It reminds us that survival and flourishing are not measured by speed, conquest, or accumulation, but by care, attentiveness, and the ability to maintain continuity across generations. This vision asks contemporary humanity to reconsider its priorities, to embrace relational intelligence, and to act with awareness of time, consequence, and responsibility. The oldest future is, therefore, not a distant ideal, but a living possibility. It exists wherever knowledge is preserved, memory is honored, and relationships, social, ecological, and ethical, are maintained. It challenges assumptions about progress and intelligence, showing that endurance, balance, and continuity are among humanity's highest achievements. Listening to these lessons, reflecting on their implications, and acting with care may allow modern societies not only to survive, but to thrive in a world increasingly fragile and interconnected. In this vision, the past informs the future, memory guides action, and the oldest culture continues to speak. It is a future that values understanding over domination, continuity over conquest, and care over consumption. It is a future in which humanity can learn to walk lightly on the earth, respect the wisdom embedded in generations, and act in ways that honor the long arc of life itself. In the quiet of reflection, after tens of thousands of years have unfolded and countless generations have carried memory across land, the story returns to stillness. To stand in this presence is to confront the vastness of time, the fragility of human life, and the persistence of culture that refuses to vanish. It is a moment to pause, to measure ourselves against the immense span of history, and to feel the resonance of lives lived with attention, care, and continuity. Here, humanity is both fleeting and eternal, fragile and enduring, a thread woven into the fabric of the earth itself. To comprehend such duration is to realize how brief our own moment is in comparison. Generations pass quickly, empires rise and fall, knowledge is recorded, lost, and rewritten. Yet this culture, the longest unbroken human story in existence, has endured through countless environmental upheavals, social disruptions, and attempts at erasure. It has survived because it is relational, adaptive, and ethical. Its endurance is a quiet testament to the power of attentiveness, memory, and responsibility across millennia. Silence here is not emptiness. It is layered with the presence of ancestors, the weight of stories, and the memory of land. Every river, every hill, every stretch of desert carries knowledge encoded over tens of thousands of years. Walking across this land is not merely movement. It is participation in an ongoing conversation with the past. To breathe here is to inhabit space where time is not linear, but expansive, where past, present, and future coexist and inform one another. The stillness is alive with history and meaning. In contemplating this deep history, we are invited to recognize the central principle that has enabled such endurance: relationship. Humans survive not by domination or accumulation, but through careful, attentive engagement with their environment, their community, and their own history. Every action, whether hunting, moving, performing ceremony, or telling a story, was relational. Each choice reflected responsibility toward ancestors, descendants, and the land. This relational framework allowed knowledge to persist, memory to travel, and culture to endure where others might have faltered. The land itself emerges as a participant, not a backdrop. It is remembered, honored, and respected. Knowledge of the land is encoded in songlines, stories, and ritual. It is learned by walking, observing, and listening. Survival is inseparable from environmental intelligence. Continuity is inseparable from ecological awareness. The human presence on this continent is defined not by extraction, but by harmony with deep time patterns. In this, we see a model of coexistence that contrasts sharply with modern assumptions about progress and mastery. Memory, too, is central. Oral traditions, ceremonies, and stories act as repositories of accumulated knowledge, ethics, and understanding. They link individuals to ancestors, to place, and to the broader temporal flow. Memory is not static. It is activated through practice, performance, and repetition. It travels with people, enabling adaptation without losing coherence. Even when displacement, disease, or colonial disruption attempted to sever the chain, memory persisted. It hid, waited, and re-emerged when circumstances allowed, ensuring the survival of culture across the centuries. Identity in this framework is inseparable from continuity. People are defined not only by their immediate social groups, but by participation in a temporal and spatial lineage. Responsibility to the past and care for the future are integral to what it means to belong. Knowledge, ethics, and memory are shared obligations distributed across generations, ensuring resilience against disruption. To know oneself is to know one's ancestors, one's land, and one's role in the ongoing story of existence. Endurance is another defining principle. Over 50,000 years, This culture faced ecological shifts, ice ages, rising seas, colonization, and cultural suppression. Each challenge tested the systems of memory, ethics, and relationship that sustained it. Yet continuity was preserved because adaptation occurred within the framework of principle rather than in opposition to it. Flexibility was grounded in ethics. Innovation was guided by responsibility. Survival depended on attention and care. Endurance was active, not passive, and it demanded intelligence of the deepest kind. Silence and reflection are essential to understanding this story. Unlike histories measured by conquest, monument, or written record, this culture's continuity is quiet, subtle, and relational. Its power is in the persistence of practice, memory, and connection, rather than spectacle. Witnessing it requires attentiveness. It requires a willingness to perceive value in endurance, subtlety, and relational intelligence, rather than in accumulation or visibility alone. There is also a lesson in humility embedded in this long perspective. Humans are small in the vast scale of time and ecological complexity. Survival, over tens of thousands of years, is not achieved through force alone, but through awareness, care, and alignment with natural rhythms. Mastery is not control, but understanding. Knowledge is not domination, but attentiveness. Life is measured not by immediate triumph, but by the ability to endure responsibly through countless generations. This perspective reframes the way we think about history, culture, and civilization. Progress is not linear, and intelligence is not only technological. True achievement can be measured in resilience, relational awareness, ethical action, and continuity. These are forms of success that modern societies often overlook, yet they are among the most profound human accomplishments. The longest unbroken culture demonstrates that endurance is a higher form of intelligence than dominance, patience a greater strength than speed, and care a more lasting contribution than conquest. In the stillness, one also feels the presence of loss, absence, and trauma. Centuries of disruption have left scars. Displacement, violence, and erasure have challenged continuity. Yet even in these fractures, memory persists. Knowledge survives, often hidden, often silent, awaiting the moment when it can re-emerge. The persistence of culture in the face of adversity is itself a form of resilience that demands recognition and reverence. To stand in this moment is to be humbled by the scale of human history. It is to recognize that individual lives, empires, and even civilizations are brief compared to the endurance of culture built on relationship, memory, and care. It is to understand that survival is not merely biological, but ethical, relational, and temporal. To witness continuity is to see human intelligence expressed across deep time. This quiet conclusion reminds us that culture is living, not frozen. It exists in practice, in memory, and in relationship. It is sustained not by monuments or texts alone, but by action, observation, and ethical engagement. Continuity is maintained through attentiveness, care, and deliberate effort, generation after generation. In this way, the past continues into the present, and the present carries the possibility of guiding the future. Humanity, placed against this vast backdrop, is both transient and enduring. Individual lives are brief, yet they are threads within a tapestry woven across 50,000 years. Each action, each decision, carries consequences that ripple through generations. Every choice to observe, remember, care, or act responsibly contributes to continuity, just as every neglectful act can threaten it. The story of the world's oldest culture teaches that endurance is an achievement of intelligence, ethics, and relational awareness. The stillness at the end of this journey is not emptiness, but fullness. It is the presence of countless generations of wisdom embedded in land, song, and story. It is the quiet knowledge that survival is possible, not through force alone, but through memory, care, and relationship. To listen here is to hear continuity speaking, a voice that stretches across time, inviting us to recognize our place, responsibility, and potential within the flow of history. In these moments, humanity is seen in its truest form, brief in individual life, fragile in the face of disruption, yet capable of enduring through intelligence, ethics, and memory. The longest unbroken culture is both guide and mirror, reflects what humans can achieve when they act with care and responsibility, and it guides what might be possible if we listen, remember, and act in ways that honor the long arc of life itself. Here, standing in stillness, the story does not end. It continues, flowing through memory, land, and practice, reminding us that the human journey is deepest when it carries with it the weight of responsibility, the persistence of continuity, and the quiet power of enduring intelligence.